On a crisp autumn morning in October 1973, millions of commuters across the Western world woke up to a sudden, jarring reality. The local gas station, a ubiquitous symbol of post-war prosperity and limitless mobility, was suddenly closed, completely out of fuel. Those that remained open featured lines of idling cars stretching for miles, with drivers waiting hours just to purchase a few heavily rationed gallons. This was not a natural disaster or a localized logistical failure, but the deliberate detonation of a new kind of geopolitical weapon. The realization of this vulnerability struck at the very core of industrialized societies. Entire economies had been constructed on the unquestioned assumption of cheap, infinitely available energy. Factories, supply networks, and sprawling suburban developments all required a constant, uninterrupted flow of petroleum to function. When that flow was abruptly constricted by forces thousands of miles away, the illusion of total economic independence instantly shattered, leaving political leaders and everyday citizens alike scrambling to understand the new rules of a deeply interconnected world. The catalyst for this sudden paralysis was a coordinated geopolitical maneuver. In response to Western support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, a subset of the broader OPEC cartel, led prominently by Saudi Arabia, initiated a total oil embargo. This was a calculated strategic decision to leverage control over a vital natural resource to achieve political objectives. The era of Western oil companies dictating terms to Middle Eastern producers had effectively ended overnight. The immediate financial shockwaves were unprecedented in modern market history. By drastically cutting the global supply of crude oil, the cartel forced a violent upward repricing of energy across all markets. Within a matter of months, the price of a barrel of oil quadrupled, skyrocketing from roughly $3 to nearly $12. This sudden explosion in energy prices acted as a massive, unavoidable tax on every sector of the global economy, instantly rewriting the balance sheets of multinational corporations and household budgets alike. On the ground, the crisis manifested in profound behavioral changes and deep public anxiety. Governments implemented draconian rationing systems, such as allowing consumers to purchase gasoline only on alternating days based on the odd or even numbers of their license plates. National speed limits were drastically lowered in a desperate bid to conserve fuel, while holiday lights were extinguished to save electricity. The sheer psychological weight of scarcity transformed the daily routines of millions, embedding a deep-seated fear of resource depletion into the public consciousness. The automotive industry, the undisputed engine of American manufacturing dominance, was caught entirely off guard by this new paradigm. For decades, Detroit automakers had prioritized size, horsepower, and luxury, producing massive vehicles that consumed fuel at prodigious rates. When the embargo hit, these mechanical behemoths suddenly became unsellable liabilities sitting on dealer lots. The strategic failure to anticipate energy scarcity left legacy manufacturers highly exposed to a rapid shift in consumer preferences, threatening the livelihoods of hundreds of thousands of factory workers. This domestic corporate miscalculation opened a massive window of opportunity for international competitors. Japanese automakers who had long specialized in producing smaller, highly fuel-efficient vehicles suited for their own resource-constrained island nation rapidly seized market share. Their technological edge in engine efficiency and compact design perfectly matched the new economic reality. This pivot not only reshaped the automotive landscape, but permanently altered global trade flows, establishing a new standard for industrial engineering that prioritized optimization over sheer power. The chaos at the pumps and the breakdown of industrial logistics forced a fundamental rethinking of how goods and resources were managed. Corporations realized they could no longer rely on fragile, single-source procurement networks. This era birthed the modern imperative of supply chain resilience, a concept defining a system's ability to anticipate, absorb, and recover from unexpected disruptions. Businesses began diversifying their suppliers and hoarding critical inventory, fundamentally altering the lean manufacturing philosophies that had previously dominated corporate strategy. Beyond the immediate shortages, the embargo triggered a macroeconomic nightmare that defied the established economic theories of the time. The quadrupling of oil prices injected massive costs into the production of virtually every good and service, driving inflation to double-digit levels. Simultaneously, the resulting economic contraction caused unemployment to spike. This toxic combination of stagnant growth and runaway inflation became known as stagflation, a phenomenon that paralyzed policymakers who were accustomed to fighting either inflation or unemployment, but never both at the same time. Central banks found themselves completely disarmed by this unique crisis. In modern financial emergencies, central banks frequently deploy quantitative easing, a monetary policy where a central bank purchases government securities to inject liquidity directly into the economy and stimulate growth. However, in the inflationary firestorm of the 1970s, injecting more money would have only accelerated the destruction of purchasing power. Policymakers were forced to endure a grueling period of economic pain, unable to simply print their way out of a fundamental supply shock. As Western economies floundered, the embargo initiated one of the largest and most rapid transfers of wealth in human history. Hundreds of billions of dollars flowed out of industrialized nations and directly into the treasuries of oil-producing states in the Middle East. This massive influx of capital fundamentally reshaped the geopolitical landscape, transforming previously developing nations into financial heavyweights with immense global influence. The balance of monetary power shifted eastward, creating a new class of sovereign wealth that required immediate management and deployment. This tidal wave of new wealth birthed the phenomenon of petrodollar recycling. Gulf nations, unable to immediately absorb such vast sums of capital into their domestic economies, deposited their newly acquired billions into major Western commercial banks. These financial institutions, suddenly flush with an unprecedented surge of liquidity, eagerly sought out new avenues to generate returns on these massive deposits. The global banking system became the critical intermediary, desperately searching for borrowers capable of absorbing this colossal influx of recycled oil money. To deploy these petrodollars, Western banks aggressively pivoted their lending strategies toward developing nations, particularly in Latin America. Eager for capital to fund infrastructure and industrialization, these countries took on massive loans denominated in US dollars, often at variable interest rates. This aggressive corporate lending spree generated massive short-term profits for the banks, but quietly built a towering house of cards. The global financial system had effectively tethered the economic fate of the developing world directly to the volatile price of crude oil. The echoes of that aggressive lending strategy would eventually trigger devastating sovereign defaults a decade later, proving that the shockwaves of the embargo extended far beyond the immediate lines at the gas station. When interest rates eventually rose to combat the lingering inflation born from the oil crisis, those developing nations found their debt burdens completely unsustainable. The resulting Latin American debt crisis demonstrated how a single commodity disruption could permanently rewire the architecture of international finance. To survive in this newly volatile landscape, the financial industry had to invent new mechanisms for risk management. The era of stable, predictable commodity costs was dead, replaced by wild price swings that could bankrupt a company overnight. This desperate need for stability accelerated the development and widespread adoption of the oil derivative, a financial contract whose value relies on an underlying asset like crude oil. These instruments allowed airlines, shipping fleets, and manufacturers to lock in future prices, effectively hedging against the threat of another sudden explosion in energy costs. Governments, terrified by their own vulnerability, moved aggressively to institutionalize panic prevention. The United States established the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, a massive network of underground salt caverns designed to hold millions of barrels of emergency crude. Simultaneously, Western nations banded together to form the International Energy Agency, creating a unified framework to coordinate responses to future supply disruptions. The goal was to ensure that no single cartel could ever again hold the industrialized world hostage through the weaponization of a critical commodity. The major multinational oil companies, often referred to as the supermajors, also executed a massive strategic realignment, having lost their iron grip on Middle Eastern reserves. These corporate giants redirected billions of dollars in capital expenditure toward exploring politically stable, non-OPEC regions. This massive redirection of investment unlocked challenging new frontiers, leading to the rapid development of offshore drilling in the turbulent waters of the North Sea and the construction of the monumental Trans-Alaska pipeline system. This aggressive diversification fundamentally restructured global energy flows. By bringing vast new supplies of non-OPEC oil online, the global market slowly began to dilute the concentrated power of the cartel. The monopoly on marginal supply was broken, introducing a new era of fierce competition and complex pricing dynamics. The global economy was learning to adapt, engineering a more decentralized and resilient energy infrastructure that could better absorb the inevitable shocks of a volatile geopolitical landscape. Beyond finding new sources of oil, the crisis catalyzed the first serious, large-scale investments into alternative energy technologies. The sudden realization that fossil fuels were both finite and politically vulnerable sparked a wave of innovation in solar, wind, and geothermal power. While these technologies were in their infancy and far from commercially viable at the time, the research and development funding initiated during the 1970s laid the critical scientific groundwork for the renewable energy industries that dominate contemporary economic discussions. This pivot also awakened a broader societal awareness regarding the environmental costs of unchecked resource extraction, as nations scrambled to replace oil with coal and nuclear power for electricity generation. The resulting pollution and safety concerns sparked fierce public debates. The tension between the absolute necessity of energy security and the long-term degradation of the environment became a central economic dilemma. Citizens began demanding that both governments and corporations account for the externalized costs of their industrial activities. Over the ensuing decades, this early demand for corporate accountability evolved into highly formalized financial frameworks. The seeds planted by the environmental anxieties of the 1970s directly influenced the rise of ESG investing, an approach that evaluates a company's environmental, social, and governance practices alongside traditional financial metrics to measure long-term sustainability. Capital markets gradually recognized that dependence on volatile, polluting resources was not just an environmental hazard, but a profound, quantifiable financial risk that had to be priced into corporate valuations. For the average consumer, the legacy of the crisis permanently altered their relationship with consumption and efficiency. The era of the disposable economy faced its first serious intellectual challenge. Homeowners insulated their houses, bought energy-efficient appliances, and adjusted their thermostats, internalizing the reality that energy was a precious commodity rather than an infinite right. This cultural shift toward conservation embedded a new layer of economic rationality into household decision-making, forever changing the baseline metrics of the consumer economy. Regulatory frameworks permanently codified this new ethos of efficiency. Governments implemented strict fuel economy standards for automobiles and mandated energy efficiency ratings for buildings and consumer goods. These policies forced entire industries to innovate or face steep penalties, proving that regulatory intervention could successfully drive technological advancement when aligned with critical national security interests. The state had firmly asserted its role as the ultimate guarantor of energy stability, ending the era of entirely laissez-faire resource consumption. Modern corporations operating today still carry the genetic memory of this historic disruption. When contemporary business leaders analyze geopolitical risks, map out global supply chains, or hedge their currency exposures, they are utilizing risk management frameworks born directly from the fires of 1973. The fundamental understanding that a localized political conflict can instantaneously freeze global trade remains a central pillar of corporate strategy, forcing executives to constantly balance the pursuit of efficiency with the absolute necessity of survival. Ultimately, the events of that turbulent year represented the definitive end of the post-World War II economic boom. The long period of uninterrupted growth, fueled by artificially cheap resources and unquestioned Western hegemony, was irrevocably shattered. The global economy was forced to mature, transitioning into a highly complex, fiercely competitive, and deeply interconnected system where every market participant, from the largest sovereign wealth fund to the individual commuter, was suddenly subjected to the unforgiving laws of global supply and demand. To investigate the true legacy of the crisis is to understand the architecture of the modern world. The strategic embargo deployed in 1973 did far more than temporarily raise prices at the pump. It fundamentally reshaped global economics, permanently altered the balance of geopolitical power, and accelerated the technological innovations that define our current era. It stands as a stark, enduring reminder that in the intricate machinery of global finance, the flow of capital is always inextricably linked to the flow of energy.